Flop raise fold percentage is just basically how often you're folding to a raise when you bet the flop. 50 I think is fine. You just want to make sure again it's not too much higher than 50, or I think is a good proxy for how often people are folding their C bets to raises in the flop, because I think that's kind of the most prevalent situation where this stat gets recognized. And so if it's like 60 again, you're going to give your opponents a pretty good spot or a pretty good incentive to try and bluff raise your C bets a lot. Turn C bet and river C bet. I think it's pretty fine. I think different players have different things. I mean, you just want to make sure that you're following through enough. I think if this turn C bet starts dipping down into the 30s, it starts getting to a point where you encourage your opponents to float a lot more, just because if you're not following through that turn barrel, they can call lighter in position because they can get to showdown with weaker hands, and they can also call to float a lot more just because you're not following through, and they can put you in some tough spots. River C bet for the same reason. Again, you want to follow through enough of the time where you can put your opponent in some reverse implied odds situations. If you're willing to barrel turn and river, you're going to make them have to fold some marginal hands on the turn. Whereas if you're always giving up on the river, they can call it turn lighter just because they know they can get to showdown a lot easier. Same thing with turn fold versus C bet and river fold versus C bet. I think 40s is fine here. One thing I would say, I think that river fold versus C bet at 24 seems to me to be on the low side. If you think about, generally speaking, your opponent and what their risk reward is, let's say $100 in the pot, they've got $100 left. They're going to fire a pot size bet. If they fire a pot size bet as a bluff, they need you to fold 50% of the time to show a profit. And since you're folding so far less than 50%, if someone catches on to this, you'll find yourself in some tough spots because versus an observant opponent, they're basically going to be value pounding you on the river just because they know that they're not anywhere close to making a profit with their bluffs, since you're folding half as often as they need you to fold for a pot size bet. And so it's something where you're going to have to adapt. I think it's fine, number one, because if you're able to adapt your opponents better than they are to you, it might be fine to just have a low fold on the river, just because if you feel like your opponent is often triple barreling his bluffs, then if you call turn, often you're going to have to fold the river. But having a very low number here can get you into some spots versus observant opponents. The nice thing about this, though, is that river fold versus C bet stat takes so long to converge here. I think after I looked at some of these numbers, I think out of the 150,000 hands, this river fold to C bet came up like just a little over 100 instances. And so if you play 150,000 hands and this stat only comes up 100 times or whatever, certainly someone that only has 5,000 hands on you in your database is they're going to have nowhere near a big enough sample size to get a good read on this. So that's something going for you, is that most players, unless you play with them a ton, aren't really going to have a good idea of this number. So that's not really the biggest thing to worry about. That's kind of a general overview of what I look for, some basic numbers that I feel are decent ranges to fall in between. Reasons why they should be between those numbers. And so the last thing I would do when looking at this overall statistic is try and compare different levels. So here we're playing 1-2 and 2-4. 2-4 most likely looking at this like being our shot taking. Just a level up, just a bit higher of numbers. And as you can see, our stats kind of indicate that we are playing at a higher level, because it seems like we are playing a bit tighter. As you can see here, 27-21, which I guess is overall stats. But if you look at the, when we're playing 1-2, we're playing 29-23, and again we're playing even tighter when we're playing rush, which probably makes sense just because we're playing so many more hands. It just doesn't lot of times it makes sense to play as many weak hands just because there's a better chance if you fold quickly you can get a better hand. But just compared like the 1-2 to the 2-4, it seems like we're playing a bit tighter. Looking at the 1-1 soft flop at 44 compared to almost 46. Aggression's about the same, but I think overall, if you look at how often we are three betting a little bit less, squeezing a little bit less, so it seems like we're a bit more timid playing 2-4, which is fine. Probably passing up on some marginal spots where we might be uncomfortable playing against a good regular, but it's something to be aware of when you're playing a higher limit. And if you're maybe not having the results you're looking for, it might be because you're playing a bit more timid than you're playing at lower stakes, which if your 29-23 style running over people at 1-2 works for you, then there's a good chance it'll still work pretty well at 2-4. It's just a matter of having confidence in your game, and so that can be a kind of example or evidence that you might not be playing with the full confidence that you should be when you're moving up to the higher level, which over a limited sample for sure, but it showed up in the results so far. And so the next step, once you have kind of this general idea of your game plan, an overall view of your strategy, you want to look at if there are any weak spots. Try and use the filter and find those weak spots and go over the hands you've played there. Look at any decent to medium to big size pots and try and get an idea of if you think you've played them well, if you think you could play them better. And so in this instance, I would, like I said, one of the things I looked at, the river fold versus c-bet, I thought was a bit low. And so what I would do is just filter for hands where, I called flop c-bet, I called turn c-bet, and I called river c-bet. Filter for those hands, and I would try and analyze them and think, and try and think about ranges and think about, go over as many hands as possible and think about, okay, is this number actually too low? Am I calling too often in these spots? Are good players, and definitely try and pay more attention to hands where you have a lot of history with people and hands where you feel like you're playing against a good player, and try and figure out if you think that they're exploiting you. If you think that, again, it's going to be a small sample size just because, like I said, this stat converges pretty slowly. But if you look at the spots and you're constantly calling versus you're constantly losing because your opponent is always betting with a better hand than you, then it might tip you off that your opponents are starting to value bet you pretty relentlessly on the river, and they might not be bluffing you as much just because they might be aware that your number is a bit low. And also, like for instance, 5-bet fold, you look at how often you're folding to the pots where you fold to a 5-bet, and start analyzing your opponents, and are they the type of player that's going to be perhaps shoving light versus you? Again, when you fold versus a 5-bet, it's kind of tough to tell because you can't really tell what they're shoving with. But you kind of get an idea when you look at all the hands where you're facing a 5-bet and kind of get an idea of the type of players that are shoving versus you, and think if it's a regular, are they trying to? Does it look like they're trying to adapt to you? Does it look like even if you just pay more attention at the tables, do you feel like you're facing a lot more 5-bets than usual? And if that's the case, then you have to adjust your forwarding range such that you either 4-bet with you either are willing to stack off with weaker hands in your 4-betting range, or you just cut back on some of your 4-bet bluffs. So the next step I would do after having an overall view of my game would be to try and analyze my stats by position, which I think is, again, pretty important.